Here is the first podcast in our Inside the Summit series. This episode features Jim Hussey from Western Union speaking on the topic of sourcing change management.
Let me take a moment to give you a little bit of context and background about myself and Western Union. It may help give a little context on to the remarks that I share and my orientation. Some of the sessions I've sat in, it seemed like people were asking a lot about what the individual's role is. And then maybe that just helps you think through what it is you're hearing. I joined Western Union about 2.5 years back, and I'm responsible for our IT vendor management organization. So I report into the gentleman that owns customer care, a fellow by the name of Tim Langley Hawthorne, and he reports into our Chief Operating Officer, a fellow named David Thompson. If you are bored with the materials, you can just Google David Thompson and you'll see that he's one of the high-profile CIOs in our marketplace, and in many ways is the one charting the course for Western Union's future. Are you all familiar with Western Union? Anyone do money transfer on Western Union? Okay, it's fun. I've got a daughter that lives over in London and is getting married a year from now, so I've been using Western Union to fund the wedding, and it's been working very nicely. We are a cross-border, cross-currency money transfer platform. We are evolving our technology. Are you all IT aware? So, no? Okay, so I'll try to ratchet down some of the technology talk. But we're evolving our platform. So when you start picking up some of your social media sites and they begin to offer money transfer capabilities to you, many times that's actually Western Union in the background. So we have a Woo Connect technology, and we've been busy rolling that out globally. So global player, over 200 what we call corridors in which we do money transfer. And we're transitioning from an agent network where we've been dependent on agents for decades to now mobility. So people, the ability to transfer money direct, bank to bank and everything, pay your bills right over the phone. So there's a lot going on from a technology standpoint, which means there's a lot going on from a sourcing standpoint, which means there's a lot going on from a change management standpoint.
I'm curious, who does Western Union compete with?
That's an excellent question. The big ones are going to be MoneyGram. But we tend to get competitors in individual corridors. So someone like a PayPal, someone like a Zap, they'll compete in certain corridors. But what they begin to find is that the investment in compliance and regulatory elements from an infrastructure standpoint is really quite staggering. Compliance is our number one spend in all areas across the company. So that's why I think you wouldn't really see someone measuring up other than maybe MoneyGram, but they're still not the size or breadth that we are. Okay. All right, so we're here to talk about sourcing change management. And I was thinking and trying to pull my remarks together because I've sat in some sessions and you all have probably heard the words change management in your sessions. It gets mentioned, but at the end of the day, who actually owns it? And who is meant to drive that message forward within the organization? What I'm about to share with you is kind of my experience in dealing with change management in the sourcing sector. But I want to be clear with you, I am not a change management certified individual. Are any of you change management certified? Have any of you looked into change management certification? Would you be surprised to know that there is no such thing as a change management certification? Okay? So I've been with Western Union now for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was with an advisory firm. You all have heard their name today. It was called ISG. And many times I would be leading a transition, and the executives would bring in a firm to do change management. And they would spend a tremendous amount of money on these firms. And I'd be working on the side with the services arm, and ultimately that change management person would come in and say, "Hey, Jim, we got a presentation we have to do next week. Can I have your slides?" They take my slides, give it to corporate communications, and therein lied the change management message. Right? So you sit there and say, okay, what is it about change management that makes it so hard? So I've begun to do some research in the area of change management. And in Denver, I live in Denver. I'm sorry I didn't boast about the Broncos winning the Super Bowl. But there's an organization called ProSci. and one gentleman was saying that Magic Johnson is trying to get Peyton Manning to play in L.A. Did he leave the room? Is that a nasty rumor? Okay. There's an ADCAR structure to change management. So there's a shop up in northern Colorado called ProSci, who's one of the leading firms in the area of change management. And ADCAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And I did take the time to go through one of their weekend certification courses. And I apologize for the small print. Afterwards, I'm more than happy to share the slides with you directly, and then you're going to see some other embedded images, and I'm happy to share all of that with you as well as we go forward. So don't worry about squinting. But for those of you who have lived in sourcing, sourcing is a very different beast. And what I mean by that is when you begin to look at each of the areas of a change management methodology, sourcing absolutely ignores or is the polar opposite of what a quality change management program would have in place. So the moment you start, you're so far behind the eight ball that you're going to struggle. So what happens? When you're talking about awareness, the organization tends to be surprised. When you're trying to get people to think about moving forward, they're resisting. They're then trying to figure out what leverage do I have to stop this. And I talked at one of the sessions this morning, Western Union, in the last 20 years, we've had 5 CIOs, and we have had people in our infrastructure and application area who've outlived them all. Do you know what it's like trying to instill change in someone who's going to sit there and say, I'll be here and they'll be gone, right? So it's a little bit difficult. But the point here is we're really behind the eight ball. Change management as a discipline, even if you tried to apply the proper discipline up front, by the time it starts, you're lost. Does this surprise anybody? Does this make sense? You've lived through it. Okay. Now, at Western Union, I've got different business units. I have Western Union, I have Western Union Digital, which is a separate entity. I have Western Union Business Solutions, a separate entity, and Western Union SpeedPay, a separate entity. So I have the pleasure of having all of these organizations at different point in the change cycle and the sourcing elements as well. Okay, so what is it we really want to talk about? Why is sourcing such a challenge to so many? And again, as I mentioned, from my experience, the executive sponsors really are not very effective in support. I can tell you from sitting with CIOs who have made the decision to, and Greg, I would suspect is from your perspective, you're sitting there, you've supported the deal negotiation, it gets signed, and the CIO says, let me know when it's done. And they disappear. Jerry? No, because it depends on your definition of physical asset. We have an agent network that is in all those locations. There's certain countries that require us to have data centers and maintain data within that specific geography. In those countries, we have specific assets. But we do have assets in many countries across the globe, but it's not a perfect alignment. Okay. From an IT standpoint, we have grown through acquisition of some of our master agents. So some of our master agents still have some IT out there because their systems are still somewhat unique, but we're in the process of consolidating that from a platform standpoint. Okay? But what happens with change management? I've tried to draw on the right, and I thought maybe that would be a Disney image. When companies do think about change management, they'll tend to focus on the executives. They'll do something at a very high level. They'll make the executives feel really great, but the individuals who are actually being impacted by the change get very little. So it's a disproportionate use of the money. I was thinking about concentric circles, but I decided to go with the pyramid and say at an operations layer, These people are dealing with the fact that if you look at number 3, I'm the manager, I'm the supervisor. You're just telling me now half my team has been tagged to be sourced. But what about my guys that are going to be retained? I'm worried about what I'm losing, and very few people are focused on what it is they're keeping. All right? So when you do go through the world of change management, they have this thing called the last man syndrome. Okay? The retained organization, they think they're next. So what are we going to do as we go through the process? Okay, thank you. The point here, if I can paraphrase, is that it's okay that we focus on the leaders, because the leaders of the organizations are the one essentially setting the tone, and then that tone needs to carry through. So my answer would be maybe, or it depends. But it depends on if that leader is in fact going to be leading and not sitting back. And I think that there needs to be a balance. So for the poor individuals who just found out they've been sourced, for those individuals who are now finding out that the processes they followed historically are going to be changed because we've sourced, there's not enough attention paid to those individuals. And those are the individuals who will ultimately undermine everything you're trying to accomplish. And many times that leader that you're talking about has moved on to another role. So change within the change is almost a certainty. Did I answer that okay? All right, thanks. Okay. So this kind of just quickly summarizes what are some of the challenges that we face. So what I wanted to do was take an overlay. For those of you who's been through a sourcing transition, okay? So sourcing transition has its own language, its own rhythm. I have a team right now in the infrastructure space going through what we call compute scope. It's a team with an organization called Cognizant, and we were using them for certain aspects of our infrastructure. We've expanded that into more towers. But those new towers now have to go through a transition. And transition, whatever supplier you're talking to, they basically do the same thing. They just might put different labels on it. But you have to go through, as you'll see in that little green box, planning, knowledge acquisition, knowledge transfer. You move into stabilization, and then ultimately you move into steady state, which all sounds fine. And it is. Many of these organizations do have very good methodologies that they'll deploy. But if you look across the top line, I've overlaid the change management cycle that we all go through. All right? This is not something that's unique to Western Union. It's not something unique to any sort of a change management organization. This is simply a change management life cycle. The little star that I've tried to put here talks about when change activities tend to end. All right? So many organizations will sit there and say, transition is done. We are now in the stabilization and steady state. And that might be a town hall, a little bit of a party, and change management activities come to a close. But if you look at where people are in their individual change cycle, they're still in denial. They're angry, and you're declaring success. So there's a lot of little things we don't do to help people. So the goal of a sourcing change management structure is to help accelerate the adoption, the ability to deal with the change and be ready to perform. Does that make sense? Okay. So you see people sitting there in the party, in particular the retained organization, the CIO saying that we're successful, but the way they have to do incident management has now changed. It's become ITIL v3. Are you familiar with the term ITIL v3? It's an international standard, right? So basically when incidents occur, it's a very structured process that they must go through with your service desk. Historically, organizations may or may not have any sort of real discipline when it comes to resolving a system outage or a break. So what happens is you've sourced, the focus goes on that sourced partner, in our case Cognizant, but we're changing the process by which you load your tickets. So Cognizant gets blamed for that because they don't understand that this is just a move because we're a regulated organization and we have to be able to document our downtime. Right? So for those of you who are from a financial organization, Western Union is a nonstop environment. We do 400 transactions a second. If we're down, we impact transactions. That transaction has someone's money. We are obligated to refund that money and give them full view as to when or they'll receive that refund or when it will be paid. So we have a lot of different things we need to do. So that's why we've been moving to that. Okay? So anyway, if you just looked at this, the issue here is we're in transition. We declare success, but there's a lot of people in a state of confusion. The processes have changed. The people have changed. The tools have changed. And how are we going to deal with this going forward? Okay. Have those of you who were in transitions, did you also have change in your tools and processes along with the change in the people? Or was it a kind of a like for like? Okay. Were you already a process-driven organization? Okay. So that made it a little bit easier. Okay. So what I've done is I've worked with a lot of different organizations in my background. And I know you can't read this, so I apologize for that. But what I've tried to do is distill what we know is the sourcing transition life cycle into three broad areas. We know the dynamics that will exist in the transition phase. And during the transition phase, there's certain things we want to do. For example, if you look at the bottom, you want to understand what processes are going to be impacted. You need to get out and start educating people on those processes, get their input, begin to get some stakeholders involved. You want to have some quick wins, because what will happen in the case of Western Union, we had a real quality issue, and people tended to forget because our entire QA organization were employees. So when we made the decision to source what we call application development and maintenance, the QA organization, the one that everybody complained about, suddenly as you're going through transition, people were glorifying the work that they had done. But when you began to look at the metrics, and it's pretty easy, defect detection, defect injection, you began to see that the QA organization was very, very expensive and very, very unproductive. So now what we wanted to do is we charted here in the transition phase, what's the communication around improved quality of our QA organization? And we still do that today, 3 years into the transition, because again, people will start comparing back to what it was before. It's just a fact of life. Okay? So we talk transition. We're all excited. Momentum is occurring. We move into service adoption. I call this the bungee cord effect. Okay? So you've been running free. You've had momentum. You've had senior management looking over your shoulder. They've been visible, right? Our management is there. And now they all go away into service adoption phase. And that momentum begins to slow. And you feel that bungee cord getting tighter. And then ultimately, all the passive-aggressive behavior starts to kick in. And people start pulling it back. And they do it in a lot of sneaky ways. All right? So you really have to be aware of it. And again, there's a lot of different things that we'll be able to do here. And as I mentioned earlier, underneath each of these, I have a series of Excels that are tables that I'm more than happy to share if you're in a change management dynamic and you'd like to use it. Okay? So am I off base? No? So let me answer that in kind of a roundabout way. So the answer is yes. And the reason is because my organization, my service provider governance organization, is in fact a services expert organization. The reason I say that is because I use this tool called Syrian, which is my governance services tool, and it allows me to have the tool focused on SLA management, invoice verification, contract management, deliverables and obligations, and all those things. So what I've been able to do is hire a team who is focused on services. So they're ITIL V3, CMMI, former service providers who focus on service improvement. Okay? And as you focus on that service improvement and you peel it back, and again, my reporting chain is ultimately into the CIO, is we're able to continually monitor services, create internal training plans for our teams in a managed service setting, because it's not natural for them. So we constantly have to help them understand how to support a managed service model. And then we're constantly monitoring the suppliers to make sure they're improving the services, because it's all about continuous improvement and getting the promise of the contract that our friend Jerry has helped negotiate and made sure we got a good deal for. Did I answer your question, Jerry? Okay. So my orientation is a little bit different. If I was reporting into the procurement office, I probably would not have that responsibility. But at the end of the day, when it comes to service improvement, that's one of the key things that my teams measure. The vast majority of our spend today is IT, and the other vendor management organization is in customer care, because customer care is a hybrid of service providers and internal shared service centers. So they also have a vendor management discipline. I closely work with that organization as well. But in terms of real estate and things of that nature, that tends to go up through our procurement organization. We work very closely with the sourcing or procurement organization in terms of any of the deal structures that we want to put in place. Okay? So the good thing about my structure is that we understand the services and we're able to help. The bad thing about my organization is people then try to make us accountable. So we always kind of have that struggle, right? So we influence but don't own. Not independent. So the sourcing organization will lead what we call that evaluation. And for those of you who are familiar with the ISG model, we adhere to the ISG model. So my team is intimately involved with that process. And we will help facilitate those sessions and make sure, along with sourcing, that the appropriate people are casting their votes and providing their input in the selection of a supplier. And then once that selection is made, my team comes in and takes over, running the transition and going forward with support from our sourcing organization. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody, or is that kind of out of left field? Okay, because I know a lot of people will have a procurement background. Many will have a governance background. I'm very happy and pleased with my team having a services background. And then we're able, if we didn't have the Syrian tool, I don't think I'd be able to attack things in the same manner that I do today. Okay? But from a service adoption standpoint, right, that's to me is the biggest, most interesting thing. When I look across, again, just a little more insight into Western Union. Our ADM strategy, our partner there is TCS. Our infrastructure is primarily with Cognizant. We have multiple development partners. Some of them are expert in mobility. Some of them are expert in payments. So we have kind of what we call a framework agreement structure where we have multiple development partners doing work, and then the moment it rolls into production, the run organization takes it over. We then also have a Western Union Business Solutions that has a different, infrastructure partner in HCL, bless you. So when you look across all of these relationships, everyone kind of approaches this adoption phase in a very different fashion. Whether it be, whether it be supplier, I guess you're allergic to change management. Right? So whether you're looking at the supplier, whether you're looking at the organization, you begin to see that there's a lot of typical challenges that come up. And my preposition, let's say, the theory behind all of this is that sourcing change management is predictable. There tends to be little surprises. We can see them coming. We know they're going to come, but we don't get prepared for it. It's unfortunate. So it goes along a very predictable lifestyle. Infrastructure has its flavor. Business process has that particular world. Applications have a different way. But it's all very, very predictable. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the so-called framework. I tend to, first off, I'm colorblind, so I apologize if that is a nasty use of color. But what I tried to do is distill the change management as it relates to sourcing into logical buckets. So if I could, we've talked about the transition phase, the adoption phase, and the execution phase. And ultimately, it's all about getting to execution. If you're in a 5-year term with an agreement, you really want to be humming at month 36, right? So for you to be having that continuous improvement, realizing your efficiencies, a lot of work goes into month 12 through 36. And that's really what I look at as service adoption. But if you take the 3 major phases, let's say, from transition, adoption, execution, there are really 4 broad groups that are impacted by the decision to source. First and foremost, as you'll see in the upper transition box, is the impacted employees, right? The individuals who were sourced are the ones that get all the attention. The ones who were retained, they find out very late in the game what their role is, what their responsibility is, what is it I'm supposed to do. We don't pay enough attention to them, and it's very easy. It's fair for someone to be upset. For those who are sourced, let them know they're sourced. We need to communicate to them. Give them that information up front. Don't make them guess. We have an obligation to let them know as early in the process as possible so they can make good decisions for themselves. Now, yes, there's HR language and all those things that come into play, and I'm not suggesting you take on that responsibility. But from a change management standpoint, when sitting with HR, you need to be able to guide HR and say, let them know. For those of you who have people throughout Europe or Asia or other parts of the world, you need to be aware of those implications when it comes to moving someone out due to a sourcing relationship. But you have the impacted employees, and then once you're in the adoption phase, you need to train and skill them. In the world of in the world of change management, it's kind of fun. You go from being unconsciously competent to consciously incompetent, right? That's what's happening to your retained organization. So how do you help them become competent and begin to move towards a place where they're understanding what their roles and responsibilities are and what their questions are? So one of the things I like to do when I walk up to this individual that we call the solution delivery manager within the world of Western Union is I know if I get the answer to this question, they're unconsciously competent. What's your queue time? Anyone software development in here? Anyone deal with enhancements? Okay, it's all about queue time. Prioritization and queue time. If I say, what's your queue time, and they say 13 weeks, they're now competent. Takes time, though. That's what my guys do, try to help train them along. Okay? And then it's all about, in the execute phase, enhancement and performance. Interface resources. These are the people who are providing and touching all of those processes. So what are we going to do to help them? We need to pull them in, inform them, get their opinions, help them become part of it. And when you move into the adoption phase, you have a little bit more coaching. And then when you're in the outer phase or execution, you really want to make sure you're tracking those KPIs. Because those people, those are the ones whose life has changed as well. You've sourced some people, you retained some people. Now these are the people who wrap right around it. Your service desk, your people who have to enter tickets for IT, your people who are initiating service requests, let's say. All of that is now changed because it becomes much more structured. Process impact, we could talk a bit more about that. But again, the processes change, in particular with an IT source, and then the systems users. All right? So across the top, and I've tried to expand out a little bit on this, so I apologize for that little flow in, is each of these groups, right, to your point earlier, the boundary management is about getting a coalition team together. That coalition team's goal is to make things better. Now that we've sourced, how do we make it better? It's not a question about going back. You can sit here and in the first few minutes there may be a lot of venting and complaining. That's okay. but it's our job to help them begin the move towards making the process better. The contract is going to be fairly straightforward, but there's operational realities of that source and contract that we need to influence and make sure the teams feel like they're able to give that input and it takes shape. Okay? So if you break it down, there's really 5 core groups in your organization that need to be addressed from a change management standpoint. And it's honestly something that can be done. Now, the interesting challenge we have is this. Is it HR's responsibility? Yeah. Right? Is it corporate communications? Maybe. Is it your IT organization? Is it your business organization? Change management seems to kind of get passed around and no one really necessarily owns it. And then if they do own it, they don't necessarily understand the services. So however your organization attacks it, as long as we understand the services and the impacts to people's lives, I think we can do a much better job. Okay? So I'm only allowed to have 10 slides in here. So I only have, I think, 3 more. I know you can't read this, so please don't. I've got 10? Okay. I'll get through it quick. My email is jim.hussey@westernunion.com. I will send you the Excel, which all this is extracted from. The only thing I ask is if you do use it and you make improvements, send it back to me. Okay? Open source. There's nothing here that people haven't figured out for themselves. The issue here is a structure. Okay? So when you go into transition, there's no communications with the stakeholders. I cannot point to a CIO that I worked with in my years as a consultant, and they said, yes, I talked to the head of sales. Yes, I talked to the head of operations. They're all on board. Right? We'll do this. They won't even know it. We'll just do it behind the curtain. Doesn't happen. Okay? So we need to make sure at this early stage that there's communications. Are there any service providers in this room? Okay. There is no such thing as a non-impact transition. Okay? I use them all, as I mentioned, all the people we use. Every one of them will sit there and say, there'll be no business disruption because of this transition. Never happened. Be upfront. We know there's going to be an impact. We have to tell our business and our stakeholders what that impact is, and we have to manage that impact. Right? Typically in transition, there's no focus on process. It's all about people. But the process is what's going to get you. And then poor engagement of the retained team. And unfortunately, I see this time and time again. All right? And then also what happens is, to your point earlier, the executive comes in, they paint these rosy pictures, and there's no detail. And then they leave. So it's time to give a little bit of insight here. Adoption. You can read all the top. But the issue here is that the mid-level managers ultimately are where the rubber is going to meet the road. And the passive-aggressive behavior comes up in so many different ways. So many different ways. It's really very interesting to see. They're very crafty. Okay? I know right now with my Woods Business Solutions, I can see, because all the purchasing flows through my area, I can see how they're purchasing around what they sourced. Someone's going to come back and ask a question, why are you spending that money? And they're going to come back and say, well, they're not ready. Right? So I've got my team ready for that one. Retained team is not held accountable. This is a beautiful thing. If something gets sourced, all of a sudden the retained team stands back. They don't know what they're doing. But if they had hired an individual to do that task and they had trouble, they jump in and help them. So how do we make that retained team really begin to feel like it's team? Okay? And then the back channel communications are prevalent. Anticipate it. You know it's going to happen. And it happens over time on a repetitive basis. Okay? Now we come to the sourcing change management execution phase. Okay? I think there's going to be a lot of very interesting things going on here. My organization has not outsourced the business processes in a very significant way. However, they're looking at automation today and robotics. I'm not sure what that's going to mean from a change management standpoint. Is it easier to tell someone they lost their job because it's been sourced or it's been automated? That's going to be something that I think a lot of organizations over the next year or two will be dealing with, okay? But we have to communicate when we're in this. Executives, we have to keep the executives involved, right? They're on to the next challenge. They're on to the next initiative, right? In my world, we're on to a major data center transformation. We can't assume that all of our application work is all set and done, right? So we're trying to drive communications and key metrics across all the areas. Onboarding of new stakeholders. Someone will come in, right? We've got a gentleman who's going to be responsible for our global shared service centers. They know nothing about the strategy that was designed 3 years ago. They're going to want to come in and put their stamp on their business. We have to educate them on why we did what we did, the benefits we're realizing today, and then give them the chance to put their little bit of a spin on it. Okay? And don't forget, initiatives become ancient history very, very quickly. All right, so what is it we really want to do? And I think I'm doing 5. I'm at the 5-minute mark. All right? It is predictable. You should only go through this once. Once you source, in our case, we sourced our application development maintenance. Everyone knows it's a 5-year term. So I'm in a better position to deal with change management as that term begins to come towards us. I'm looking at the fall of this year to begin to lead internal conversations around, do we renew? Do we competitively bid? Do we set up our own operation? Meaning we insource but set up our own captive center in India or wherever it may be. So those are the things that you should be able to begin discussing and get that broader team involved. So you should only go through this once in the particular areas that you're dealing with. Be very clear roles and responsibilities. Not all change management is of equal value, to your point earlier, sir. There will be change. Again, in my former life, I would end up facilitating the agreement, setting up the strategy, help do the organizational design. I'd come back 6 months later. People are gone. The org structure is totally different. So you have to kind of make do and be willing to be flexible because change will always be there. But always track your metrics. Communicate your metrics. We talked early today in one of the sessions about KPIs and a dashboard. And, sometimes you might get caught up on how it looks, but it's important you have metrics and that you're able to draw it back to where you were, where you are today, and importantly, where you're going. Okay? So for me, my world is now centered around the role of automation and robotics. Right? So I know in certain areas that sourcing change management is predictable, but I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, as I said a moment ago, when we begin to look at these other elements in our environment. Okay? So I'm pretty sure I'm ready for champagne. Right. Any questions? So what we will do is my team today does semi-annual operational audits and semi-annual knowledge management audits. So that combined with our performance metrics that are standard service levels, and then of course our spend analysis, making sure that the spend is consistent with the agreement and we've controlled all the value leakage. We then will sit with our IT leadership and say, is this aligned to your roadmap, right? So for us right now, we're dealing with a lot of new technologies coming into our ecosystem. Not so much suppliers, but things like TIBCO, Informatica. Believe me, are any of you guys dealing with point of sale and mobility type of situations? It's unbelievable the technologies that are coming at us right now in an InfoSec type of setting. But to your question, once we decide our strategy as an IT organization, we will engage our sourcing partners, procurement, to help drive that ultimate contractual structure. The procurement organization will then make the decision whether or not they have the bandwidth to support it, or if they need to seek outside counsel to help support that negotiation, or if they need to seek outside advisory support to do that. But ultimately, we control the strategy. We leverage their skills and capabilities to make sure we have the right structure and the current structure. So, for example, today, I don't know how to contract for automation. We have automation targets within certain technology areas, but I'm not sure what that's going to look like in the future. So we'll begin to, with sourcing, go out to some advisory firms and try to understand, and legal firms, and try to understand what's happening out there. But from a service performance standpoint, our solution delivery managers who are part of IT, they own the outcome. Our job is to continually flag what they can do to realize better performance.